Think about the last person you spoke to today. Now imagine something terrifying. You wake up tomorrow and nobody speaks to you. Not your friends, not your family, not even a stranger. Nobody. You eat alone, you work alone, you sleep alone. And tomorrow it happens again, then again and again. What would that do to your mind? Because in 1829, a prison in Philadelphia decided to find out. And here's the strange part. They didn't think they were torturing people. They thought they were helping them. This was Eastern State Penitentiary. From above, it looked like a giant wheel. 7 prison blocks stretched out from one central point. Every prisoner had their own cell, their own bed, their own work, their own little exercise yard, and almost no human contact. Even when prisoners were moved through the building, they could be covered with hoods so they wouldn't see other prisoners, and other prisoners wouldn't see them. The goal was simple. Keep criminals away from each other, because the reformers believed criminals taught each other how to become worse. So instead of putting prisoners together, they separated them completely. The people behind this system genuinely believed it could change criminals. In 1787, Philadelphia reformers, including Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush, had pushed for a more humane prison system. They believed people could change. So Pennsylvania funded a new experiment. The prisoner would be given food, work, a Bible, and something else. Silence. The theory was that if you removed every distraction, there would be nowhere left to look except inside yourself. You would think about what you'd done, feel regret, and eventually become a better person. That's why they called it a penitentiary. The whole system was designed around one idea. Isolation would create repentance. Then, in 1842, one of the most famous writers in the world walked inside, Charles Dickens. He had specifically wanted to see Eastern State. At the time, the prison was famous. People were studying its system as a new model for punishment. But Dickens noticed something the architects couldn't fix: the silence. He walked through the corridors and saw prisoners working alone inside their cells. No conversations, no groups, no normal prison noise, just occasional sounds from a man's work before the walls swallowed them. And Dickens came to a brutal conclusion. He believed the system was humane in its intention, but cruel in its effects, because you can see a physical beating, you can see the wound. But what happens when the damage is happening inside someone's mind? Here's where the story gets darker. People were already arguing about this. Critics of the Pennsylvania system warned that extreme isolation could cause mental illness and even death. So this wasn't a problem nobody had imagined. The warning was already there, and the prison's own doctors recorded cases of mental illness among prisoners. They saw people breaking down, they wrote it down, but then came the explanation. Instead of asking, "Is isolation causing this?" some physicians blamed the prisoners themselves. In particular, they attributed cases among Black prisoners to supposed racial predispositions to mental illness. Think about what just happened. The evidence was in front of them, but instead of questioning the system, they found another explanation. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. Imagine running an experiment. You create the conditions, you watch what happens, you collect the evidence. Then the evidence starts telling you that your idea might be hurting people. You have two choices. You can question the experiment, or you can question the people inside it. Eastern State's history shows that both the supporters and critics of solitary confinement were arguing about its effects while the system was operating. The disagreement wasn't about whether people were suffering. The argument was about why. Was the prison causing it, or were certain prisoners simply more likely to break? That difference mattered, because if the prison was the problem, the prison had to change. Nearly 50 years after Dickens visited, the argument reached America's Supreme Court. In 1890, Justice Samuel Miller described what experience with solitary confinement had shown. Some prisoners became almost impossible to wake from a stunned condition. Others became violently insane. Others killed themselves. And here's the part that should make you stop. Remember why the system existed in the first place. It was supposed to make people better. Yet decades of experience were showing that isolation could do the opposite. The experiment had a problem, a very big one. So why did the system finally disappear? You might expect a dramatic moment. Maybe everyone finally admitted they were wrong. But history is usually less satisfying than that. The prison simply became too crowded. Eastern State was designed for about 250 prisoners. Decades later, it held far more. The original system of complete isolation became harder and harder to maintain. Prisoners began sharing cells. The strict separation started breaking down. And in 1913, Pennsylvania officially abandoned the system. Not because everyone suddenly agreed, not because one person won the argument. The system had simply become impossible to run the way it was designed. And here's the part that makes this story relevant today. The idea of solitary confinement didn't disappear. It survived. The prison eventually stopped using isolation as its basic correctional philosophy, but isolation remained part of prison punishment. So the question Eastern State raised never really disappeared. How much isolation can a human being endure before solitude stops being reflection and becomes something else? The people who designed Eastern State believed silence would make prisoners look inward. They thought that if you removed every other voice, a person would finally hear himself clearly. But Charles Dickens walked through those silent corridors and saw something different. The doctors recorded people breaking down. Critics warned about the damage. And decades later, the Supreme Court described prisoners becoming mentally broken, violently insane, and suicidal. Maybe the lesson isn't that solitude is always bad. Maybe it's simpler than that. At first, you might enjoy the silence, then you'd get used to it. And eventually, you might start wishing for something you once completely ignored. Someone saying your name, someone asking how you're doing, someone simply talking to you. Because sometimes we don't realize how important human connection is until there's nobody left to give it to us. And that may be the real lesson Eastern State left behind. Silence doesn't always help us hear ourselves. Sometimes, it makes us disappear.